The cold autumn wind swept across the Wyoming Territory cemetery as Hannah Morrison's tears fell upon freshly turned earth. Her shoulders shook with each silent sob, gloved fingers clutching a worn leather journal to her chest, like it was the last connection to the heart that no longer beat. She'd been coming to this grave every day for 3 weeks, watching as the dirt settled and wildflowers began to take root along the edges of what was now her father's final resting place. Hannah didn't hear the approaching hoofbeats, too lost in grief to notice anything beyond the weathered headstone. When a shadow fell across the grave, she startled, looking up to find a tall stranger dismounting from a chestnut stallion. In his hand, a modest bouquet of prairie wildflowers bound with a simple leather cord. The man approached slowly, his spurs jingling softly with each step. His face was partly obscured by the wide brim of his hat, but Hannah could see he was young, perhaps 30, with kind eyes that seemed to understand loss in a way most couldn't. Without speaking, he knelt beside her and placed the flowers at the base of the headstone. Then, in a voice as gentle as the evening breeze, he said, "You don't have to be alone." Hannah stiffened, clutching the journal tighter. "I don't know you, sir." "Matthew Reed," he offered, standing and removing his hat in a gesture of respect. "I knew your father." Hannah's breath caught in her throat. Thomas Morrison had been many things to many people: a respected shopkeeper, a former lawman, a friend to most in the small town of Pine Creek. But in the 3 years since they'd settled here after her mother's passing, Hannah thought she'd met all his acquaintances. "How?" she asked, her voice barely audible above the whisper of wind through the cemetery pines. "He saved my life once," Matthew said, his eyes drifting to the headstone. "Took a bullet that was meant for me during a bank robbery in Cheyenne. I was just passing through Pine Creek when I heard about his passing." He paused, studying her face. "You look like him, same determined eyes." Hannah stood, brushing dirt from her black mourning dress. At 22, she'd already worn mourning clothes for too many loved ones. "Thank you for the flowers, Mr. Reed, but I should be going." "Town's a fair walk from here," Matthew observed, glancing at the darkening sky. "I'd be happy to offer you a ride back." "I have my father's wagon," Hannah replied, gesturing to where the old vehicle was hitched beyond the cemetery gates, "and I'm quite capable of handling it myself." A smile touched the corners of Matthew's mouth. "I don't doubt that for a moment, Miss Morrison. But it's getting dark, and the road back to town isn't the safest after sundown." Hannah was about to refuse again when she heard distant howls wolves in the foothills, closer than she'd like. She'd delayed too long at the grave today. "Very well," she conceded reluctantly. "You may ride alongside if you wish." Matthew nodded, replacing his hat. "I'd be obliged." The journey back to town was mostly silent, save for the creaking of wagon wheels and the steady rhythm of Matthew's horse keeping pace beside them. Hannah found herself stealing glances at the stranger. He didn't look like most cowboys who passed through Pine Creek. There was something more refined in his bearing, despite his trail-worn clothes and the revolver holstered at his hip. "Were you a lawman too?" Hannah asked suddenly, breaking the silence. Matthew's expression shifted, something unreadable passing over his features. "For a time, now I'm just a man trying to make my way." "And what brings you to Pine Creek, beyond paying respects?" Hannah pressed, suddenly wondering if his appearance at her father's grave was truly coincidental. "Your father wrote to me," Matthew admitted after a moment's hesitation. "Asked if I might come help with some trouble he was having." Hannah's hands tightened on the reins. What trouble? He didn't say specifically. Just that there were men pressuring him about the store, and he thought having an old friend around might discourage them. A chill ran down Hannah's spine that had nothing to do with the evening air. Since her father's unexpected death, a fall down the store's cellar stairs that the doctor had called a tragic accident, several men had approached her about selling the general store. The offers had grown increasingly less polite with each refusal. "When did he write to you?" Hannah asked, her voice steady despite the turmoil she felt. "About a month ago. I was working a cattle drive up north, couldn't get away immediately. Regret shadowed his face. If I'd known how urgent it was. You couldn't have known, Hannah said softly, surprising herself with the impulse to comfort this stranger. They reached the edge of town, where oil lamps were being lit along Main Street. Hannah directed the wagon toward the modest two-story building that housed both Morrison's general store and the living quarters above it. "This is where I leave you," Hannah said as she pulled the wagon to a stop. "Thank you for your escort, Mr. Reed." Matthew dismounted, coming around to help her down from the wagon seat. When she placed her hands on his shoulders, allowing him to lift her to the ground, Hannah was struck by the strange sense of familiarity, as if she'd known this man longer than the brief hour of their acquaintance. "Will you be staying in Pine Creek long?" she asked, stepping back quickly and smoothing her skirts. "I reckon I might," Matthew replied, his eyes scanning the darkened storefront. "I owe your father that much," Hannah nodded, unsure what to make of this man and his connection to her father. "The boarding house is 2 blocks down. Mrs. Williams keeps clean rooms. Tell her I sent you." "Much obliged." Matthew tipped his hat. "Would it be all right if I called on you tomorrow? I'd like to know more about what your father was facing." Hannah hesitated, her mind filled with warnings about strange men and their motives. But something in Matthew Reed's steady gaze made her trust him, perhaps the same something her father had seen. "Yes," she decided. "The store opens at 8. With that, she turned and unlocked the door to her empty home, feeling Matthew's eyes on her back until she was safely inside. Only then did she allow herself to release a shaky breath, wondering what trouble her father had feared enough to summon a former lawman, and whether that trouble had anything to do with his death. Dawn broke cold and clear over Pine Creek, sunlight filtering through the calico curtains of Hannah's bedroom window. She'd slept fitfully, her dreams haunted by her father's voice and the mysterious stranger who claimed to know him. Rising earlier than usual, she dressed in a simple blue work dress, pinning her chestnut hair into a practical bun before descending to the store below. The familiar scent of coffee beans, leather, and dried goods greeted her as she moved through the aisles, preparing to open for the day. Morrison's general store had been the heart of Pine Creek for 3 years, ever since her father had decided to hang up his marshal's badge and start a quieter life after her mother's death. Hannah had learned every aspect of the business, standing proudly at her father's side as they built something new together. Now it was hers alone, a thought that still caught her breath sometimes when the morning light hit the Morrison and daughter sign her father had proudly hung just last spring. At precisely 8 o'clock, Hannah unlocked the front door, turning the sign to open. She wasn't surprised when Matthew Reed appeared within minutes, hat in hand, looking fresher than he had the previous evening after his bath and night's rest at the boarding house. "Morning, Miss Morrison," he greeted, the morning light revealing features that tiredness had obscured yesterday, a strong jawline softened by the beginnings of a beard, laugh lines around eyes that had seen both joy and sorrow. "Mr. Reed," Hannah acknowledged, continuing to arrange a display of canned goods. "I trust you found Mrs. Williams's accommodations satisfactory." "Very much so," Matthew replied, looking around the well-stocked store with appreciative eyes. "Your father built a fine business here." "We built it together," Hannah corrected, unable to keep a note of pride from her voice. "And I intend to keep it thriving." Matthew nodded, studying her with newfound respect. "May I ask about these men who were troubling your father?" Hannah glanced toward the door, ensuring no customers were entering before she spoke. "There's a man named Victor Blackwood. He owns the saloon down the street and has been buying up properties all over Pine Creek. He's approached me 3 times since Father's death about selling the store." "And you refused, of course," Hannah said firmly. "This store is all I have left of my family. Besides, Pine Creek needs it. The next general store is 20 miles away in Riverton." Matthew's expression darkened. "Has Blackwood threatened you?" "Not directly," Hannah admitted. "But his associate, a man named Silas, Suggested it would be unfortunate if I had an accident like my father. Matthew's hand instinctively moved toward his holster before he caught himself. That sounds like a threat to me. The sheriff says there's nothing he can do without direct evidence, Hannah said, frustration evident in her voice. Sheriff Walton is a good man, but he's getting older and Blackwood has friends on the town council. Matthew was silent for a moment, watching as Hannah moved efficiently around the store, preparing for the day's business. Your father said you were stubborn as a mule and twice as smart, he finally said, a hint of amusement in his voice. Hannah paused, a bolts of fabric half unrolled in her hands. He said that, in his letter, Matthew confirmed, said he was prouder of you than anything he'd ever done in his life. Hannah swallowed the sudden tightness in her throat. You still have the letter. Matthew nodded, reaching into his vest pocket to produce a folded piece of paper. Here, it's yours by rights. Hannah took it with slightly trembling fingers, recognizing her father's distinctive handwriting immediately. She tucked it into her pocket, unwilling to read it while Matthew watched. Thank you. I'll look at it later. The bell above the door jangled as an elderly woman entered, ending their private conversation. Hannah greeted Mrs. Benson warmly, helping the woman find the yarn she needed while Matthew browsed the store, seemingly in no hurry to leave. As the morning progressed, a steady stream of customers kept Hannah busy. Matthew remained, occasionally helping with heavier items when needed, observing the townsfolk and their interactions with Hannah. She couldn't help noticing how naturally he fit into the environment, charming the older women and earning respectful nods from the men who came through. Just before noon, the atmosphere in the store changed perceptibly when two well-dressed men entered. The taller one, with a waxed mustache and gold watch chain gleaming across his vest, surveyed the store like a man assessing property values. The shorter, wiry man beside him had cold eyes that settled on Hannah with unsettling intensity. Miss Morrison, the taller man greeted with false warmth. Looking lovely as always, I trust you've reconsidered my generous offer. Hannah straightened her spine, meeting his gaze directly. Good morning, Mr. Blackwood. My answer remains the same. Victor Blackwood's smile tightened. I've increased my offer by 20%. That's more than fair for a business that's sure to struggle without your father's experienced hand. The business is doing just fine, as you can see, Hannah replied coolly. Now, if you're not here to make a purchase, I have paying customers to attend to. Blackwood's companion Silas, Hannah presumed, stepped forward, his hand resting casually near the gun at his hip. Miss Morrison, it's not safe for a woman alone to run a business in these parts. Accidents happen. Fires start, inventory gets damaged. Matthew chose that moment to move from the back of the store, stepping into view with deliberate casualness. Sounds like you're concerned about the lady's welfare, he said, his voice friendly but his eyes hard. That's mighty thoughtful. Blackwood turned, assessing Matthew with a quick calculating glance. And you are, Matthew Reed, friend of the Morrison family. Silas's eyes narrowed with recognition. Reed, the lawman from Wyoming Territory, Matthew smiled slightly, former lawman. Now I'm just helping Miss Morrison with her store. The tension in the room thickened. Blackwood adjusted his cuffs, his expression unreadable. I wasn't aware you had hired help, Miss Morrison. There's a lot you're not aware of, Mr. Blackwood, Hannah replied, grateful for Matthew's steady presence. Now, will you be making a purchase today? Blackwood replaced his hat with deliberate slowness. Another time, perhaps. Come, Silas. As they turned to leave, Blackwood paused at the door. My offer stands for 1 more week, Miss Morrison. After that, well, business conditions might change in Pine Creek. The bell jangled as they departed, leaving a heavy silence in their wake. Hannah released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her hands gripping the counter edge to steady herself. That was Victor Blackwood, I take it, Matthew said quietly. Hannah nodded. And his right-hand man, Silas Deering, former soldier turned hired gun if the rumors are true. Matthew's jaw tightened. Those weren't just business negotiations, that was a threat. I know, Hannah said, moving to the window to watch the two men cross the street toward the Silver Dollar Saloon Blackwood's establishment. But what can I do? I won't sell, and Sheriff Walton can't act without evidence. Matthew joined her at the window, standing close enough that Hannah could smell the clean scent of soap and leather. Your father didn't call me here just as a friend, Hannah, he said, his voice low. He knew Blackwood was dangerous. You think Blackwood had something to do with my father's death, Hannah said, the suspicion she'd harbored for weeks finally spoken aloud. I think a healthy man like your father doesn't just fall down stairs he's climbed thousands of times, Matthew replied carefully. Not without help. Hannah turned to face him, searching his eyes. Why are you really here, Mr. Reed? Is it just a debt to my father or something more? Matthew held her gaze. Your father gave me a second chance when I needed one most, helped me become a better man than I might have been. So yes, I owe him. But seeing you stand up to Blackwood just now. He paused, something shifting in his expression. I admire courage, Miss Morrison, and you have plenty of it. Before Hannah could respond, the bell above the door signaled another customer, forcing her attention back to business. But as the day continued, she found herself increasingly aware of Matthew's presence, the way he moved with quiet confidence, how customers instinctively respected him, the occasional glances he sent her way when he thought she wasn't looking. By closing time, Hannah had made a decision. After locking the door and turning the sign, she faced Matthew directly. Mr. Reed, I don't know you well enough to trust you completely, she began, choosing her words carefully. But my father evidently did, and I trust his judgment. If you believe there's more to his death than an accident, I want to know the truth. Matthew nodded solemnly. It won't be easy, and it could be dangerous. My life is already in danger if Blackwood is who you think he is, Hannah pointed out. At least this way I'm doing something about it instead of waiting for the next accident. A hint of a smile touched Matthew's lips. Your father was right about that stubbornness. Will you help me? Hannah pressed, unwilling to be distracted by his charm. Yes, Matthew said simply. I'll help you find the truth about your father's death, and I'll help you protect what he built. You have my word. Hannah extended her hand formally, as she would to seal a business arrangement. Then we have an agreement, Mr. Reed. Matthew took her hand, his calloused palm warm against hers. Matthew, he corrected gently. If we're going to be working together, you might as well use my given name. Hannah nodded, suddenly aware of how long their handshake had lasted. Matthew, then, she agreed, withdrawing her hand, and you may call me Hannah. The simple exchange of names felt strangely intimate in the quiet store, illuminated only by the fading daylight through the windows. Hannah cleared her throat, breaking the moment. We should start with my father's journal, she said, gesturing toward the stairs leading to the living quarters. He kept detailed notes about the store and his concerns. If he suspected Blackwood of anything specific, it might be recorded there. Matthew followed her up the narrow staircase to the cozy apartment above. Hannah was acutely conscious of bringing a man into her home, something that would certainly set tongues wagging if anyone in town discovered it. But the urgency of understanding her father's death outweighed concerns about propriety. The apartment was modest but comfortable, with a small parlor, kitchen, and 2 bedrooms. Hannah lit the lamps, revealing a space filled with books, handmade quilts, and the small personal touches that made it home. It's nice, Matthew observed, removing his hat respectfully. Reminds me of my mother's place before she passed. Hannah gestured toward the sofa. Please sit. Would you like coffee? No need to trouble yourself, Matthew said, but remained standing until Hannah had taken a seat in the armchair across from the sofa. Hannah reached for the leather journal she'd been holding at the cemetery. This was his personal journal. I've read parts of it, but she hesitated. It was too painful to go through it all after he died. Matthew nodded in understanding. Take your time. Hannah opened the journal, turning to entries from the past few months. Her father's familiar handwriting brought a fresh wave of grief, but she pushed through it, focusing on the task at hand. Here, she said after several minutes of silent reading. 2 months ago, he writes about Blackwood's first offer to buy the store. She read aloud. Blackwood came by again today, offered twice what the store is worth on paper, said Pine Creek is changing and I should consider my daughter's future. I told him Hannah's future is secure with the store. Don't trust his sudden interest. Hannah turned several more pages. A week later, found the back door unlocked this morning, nothing missing, but someone had been through the ledgers in my office. Only Blackwood would care about our accounts. Matthew leaned forward. He suspected Blackwood of breaking in. It seems so, Hannah confirmed, continuing to scan the pages. And here, 3 weeks before he died. Hannah doesn't know, but I've written to Matt Reed. If anyone can help sort this mess, it's him. Blackwood has half the town council in his pocket, and Sheriff Walton can't move against him without proof. Something bigger is happening here than just wanting my store. Hannah looked up, meeting Matthew's intent gaze. What did he mean, something bigger? I'm not sure, Matthew admitted. But your father was a lawman for most of his life. He had good instincts. Hannah continued reading, finding entries about strange men visiting Blackwood, late-night meetings at the Silver Dollar, and rumors of land deals far beyond Pine Creek's boundaries. The final entry, dated just 2 days before her father's death, sent a chill through her. Confronted Blackwood today about the railroad plans. He denied everything, but I saw the truth in his eyes. This isn't just about my store, it's about the whole town. If what I suspect is true, everyone in Pine Creek is in danger of losing everything. Have to find proof before it's too late. Hannah closed the journal, her mind racing. Railroad plans. There's been talk of the railroad possibly coming through this region, but nothing definite. Matthew rubbed his chin thoughtfully. If Blackwood knows something the rest of the town doesn't like the planned route for a new railroad line, he could be buying property that will multiply in value once the news becomes public. And my father discovered this somehow, Hannah said slowly. Is that enough reason to kill a man, with the kind of money involved in railroad deals? Yes, Matthew said grimly. I've seen men killed for far less. Hannah rose, pacing the small room. So Blackwood wants my store because it's on land the railroad needs. Or because it's in the path of what will become the town center once the railroad comes through, Matthew suggested. Either way, your father was a threat because he knew too much. Hannah stopped pacing, a new determination hardening within her. Then we need to find whatever proof my father was looking for. If Blackwood killed him or had him killed, I want him to pay for it. Matthew stood, his expression serious. Hannah, pursuing this means putting yourself directly in Blackwood's path. It's dangerous. I'm already in his path, Hannah countered. He's made that clear. At least this way we might find justice for my father. Matthew studied her for a long moment, respect evident in his gaze. All right, but we do this carefully, no unnecessary risks. Hannah nodded, suddenly aware of how dark it had grown outside. The impropriety of having Matthew in her home at this hour struck her anew. You should go. People will talk if they see you leaving too late. Matthew smiled faintly. Already concerned about my reputation, Miss Morrison. Despite everything, Hannah found herself returning the smile. Your reputation can survive, Mr. Reed. Mine is somewhat more delicate in a town this size. Fair point, Matthew conceded, retrieving his hat. I'll come by the store tomorrow. In the meantime, keep that journal safe. Hannah walked him to the door, an unexpected reluctance slowing her steps. At the threshold, Matthew turned, his expression growing serious again. Lock this behind me, he instructed, and Hannah, be careful. After Matthew left, Hannah secured both the apartment and store doors, checking twice to be certain. As she prepared for bed, her mind whirled with all she had learned about her father's suspicions, about Blackwood's possible motives, and about the mysterious former lawman who had arrived in her life so unexpectedly. She removed her father's letter from her pocket, finally unfolding it to read his last words to Matthew Reed. Much of it confirmed what they had already discovered, but the final paragraph caught her breath. I trust you with this information, Matt, because I trust you with what's most precious to me, my daughter's safety. Hannah is strong, but Blackwood is dangerous. If anything happens to me, she'll need someone honorable at her side. There's no one I'd trust more than you." Hannah folded the letter carefully, tears blurring her vision. Even in his concern, her father had thought of her future. He had sent for Matthew not just as an ally against Blackwood, but as someone he trusted to protect her if the worst happened. Sleep came fitfully that night. Hannah's dreams filled with images of her father, of Blackwood's threatening smile, and of Matthew Reed's steady presence, a presence that was quickly becoming more important to her than she cared to admit. The next morning dawned gray and drizzly, the kind of autumn day that kept many customers home. Hannah was grateful for the quiet, using the time to carefully review the store's ledgers and documents, searching for anything her father might have discovered about Blackwood's plans. Matthew arrived mid-morning, damp from the light rain but alert. He hung his wet coat and hat near the stove to dry, then joined Hannah behind the counter where she was examining a stack of land records. "Find anything?" he asked, standing close enough that Hannah could feel the warmth radiating from him. "Nothing definitive," she admitted, "but look at this." She pointed to a map of Pine Creek and its surroundings. Father marked properties that Blackwood has purchased in the last year. They form an almost straight line from the eastern approach to town, through Main Street and continuing west. Matthew studied the markings, his brow furrowed, a path wide enough for railroad tracks and a station. "Exactly," Hannah confirmed. "And he's been paying above market value to get them quickly and quietly." "But he doesn't have all the properties in the path," Matthew observed. "No, the livery stable, the church land, and our store are the only holdouts on Main Street." Hannah traced the line with her finger. Father must have noticed the pattern and started asking questions. The bell above the door interrupted their discussion as Sheriff Walton entered, shaking raindrops from his hat. The sheriff was in his 60s, silver-haired but still carrying himself with the authority of his position. His eyes narrowed slightly at the sight of Matthew standing so close to Hannah. "Morning, Miss Morrison," he greeted, approaching the counter. "Don't believe I've had the pleasure," he added, extending a hand to Matthew. "Matthew Reed," Matthew introduced himself, shaking the sheriff's hand firmly. "I'm helping Miss Morrison with some store matters." Recognition flickered in Walton's eyes. "Reed, weren't you a marshal up in Wyoming Territory a few years back?" "That's right," Matthew confirmed. "Based out of Cheyenne for a time." "Heard good things," Walton said, his posture relaxing slightly. "What brings you to our little corner of the territory?" Hannah intervened before Matthew could respond. "Mr. Reed was a friend of my father's. He's helping me organize some business affairs." Sheriff Walton nodded, though his expression remained thoughtful. "Good of him," he commented, before addressing Hannah directly. "Came by to check on you, Miss Morrison. Heard Blackwood paid you another visit yesterday." "News travels fast," Hannah observed dryly. "Small town," Walton replied with a shrug. "He giving you trouble?" Hannah hesitated, weighing how much to reveal. "He's persistent about buying the store, and threatening," Matthew added, ignoring Hannah's warning glance. "His man Sila's made some thinly veiled comments about accidents and fires." Sheriff Walton's jaw tightened. "That so? Wish I'd heard that myself." "Would it have mattered?" Hannah asked, unable to keep a note of bitterness from her voice. "You've said yourself there's nothing you can do without evidence." "Doesn't mean I don't care, Miss Morrison," Walton said quietly. "Your father was a good friend and a fine lawman. If Blackwood or his men step over the line, I want to know about it." Hannah softened slightly. "I appreciate that, Sheriff." Walton turned his attention back to Matthew. "How long you planning to stay in Pine Creek, Mr. Reed?" "As long as Miss Morrison needs my help," Matthew replied evenly, meeting the sheriff's assessing gaze. Something unspoken passed between the two men, a professional understanding, perhaps, or mutual recognition of the other's character. After a moment, Walton nodded. "Good to have another pair of eyes watching things," he said. "Town's changing, not all for the better." "We've noticed," Hannah said carefully. "Sheriff, have you heard anything about railroad plans for Pine Creek?" Walton's eyebrows rose. "Official plans? No. Rumors have been circulating for years, but nothing concrete." "Why do you ask?" Hannah exchanged a glance with Matthew before responding. "Just curious about what might be driving property sales in town." "Blackwood's buying spree, you mean," Walton said shrewdly. "Been watching that myself. Man's up to something, sure enough." He adjusted his gun belt, preparing to leave. "You two be careful. Blackwood doesn't like obstacles, and he's got friends in high places." "We will," Hannah assured him. After the sheriff left, Matthew turned to Hannah. "He knows more than he's saying." "I think so too," Hannah agreed, "but I'm not sure which side he's on." "Your father trusted him," Matthew pointed out. "My father also thought he could handle Blackwood without getting killed," Hannah countered, immediately regretting her sharp tone. "I'm sorry, I don't know who to trust anymore." Matthew's expression softened. "Trust your instincts, Hannah." "They seem pretty sound to me." The compliment warmed her unexpectedly. "Thank you." They spent the rest of the morning attending to customers and discussing possible approaches to uncovering Blackwood's plans. As noon approached, Matthew offered to fetch lunch from the cafe down the street, leaving Hannah alone in the store. She was reorganizing a display of work gloves when the back door rattled, followed by the sound of breaking glass. Heart pounding, Hannah reached beneath the counter for the shotgun her father had always kept there, moving cautiously toward the storeroom. "Who's there?" she called, raising the weapon. "I'm armed," silence answered her. Hannah inched forward, the shotgun steady in her hands. The storeroom window had been broken, glass littering the floor beneath it, but there was no sign of an intruder. A rock lay amid the glass, wrapped in a piece of paper. Keeping the shotgun ready, Hannah used her foot to slide the rock toward her, then carefully unwrapped the note. The message was brief and chilling. Last warning, sell or burn. Hannah was still staring at the note when Matthew returned, lunch parcels in hand. He took in the situation at a glance: the broken window, the shotgun in Hannah's hands, the paper clutched in her fingers. "Are you hurt?" he asked, setting down the food and crossing to her side. Hannah shook her head, handing him the note. "They didn't come in, just left this." Matthew read it, his expression hardening. "This is crossing the line. We should show the sheriff." "And he'll do what?" Hannah asked, finally lowering the shotgun. "Tell Blackwood to be nicer with his threats. We need proof of what Blackwood is planning and what he did to my father." Matthew didn't argue, instead moving to examine the broken window. "We'll need to board this up before nightfall." "And you shouldn't stay here alone tonight." Hannah bristled slightly. "I'm not leaving my home." "I didn't suggest you should," Matthew replied calmly, "but I'll be staying in your storeroom." "That's not proper." Matthew finished for her, a hint of amusement in his eyes despite the serious situation. "Neither is letting you face armed intruders alone. I'll sleep on the floor down here, not upstairs. Your reputation will survive." Hannah wanted to protest further, but found she couldn't. The thought of staying alone after such a direct threat was more frightening than she cared to admit. "Fine," she conceded, "but just for tonight." Matthew nodded, turning his attention back to the window. "I'll get some boards from the lumber yard. Do you have tools?" "In the back room," Hannah directed him. "And Matthew, thank you." His expression softened momentarily. "You don't have to thank me, Hannah. I promised your father I'd help, and I keep my promises." As Matthew set about repairing the window, Hannah found herself watching him work, struck by the efficiency of his movements and the care he took with her property. There was something comforting about his presence, a steadiness that made her feel safer than she had since her father's death. It was dangerous, she knew, to become dependent on that feeling. Matthew Reed would eventually leave Pine Creek once this business with Blackwood was concluded. Her father had called him a drifter in his letter, a good man, but not one who stayed in one place for long. Hannah forced herself to focus on practical matters, sweeping up the broken glass while Matthew secured boards over the window. They worked together in comfortable silence, establishing a rhythm that felt surprisingly natural. By closing time, the window was securely boarded, and Matthew had brought his few belongings from the boarding house: a bedroll, a small bag of clothing, and his rifle. Hannah felt a strange mix of relief and apprehension as she locked the front door, knowing he would be staying. "I'll make supper," she offered, leading the way upstairs. "It's the least I can do." "I won't refuse a home-cooked meal," Matthew replied with a smile that transformed his serious face, creating creases at the corners of his eyes that Hannah found unexpectedly appealing. The domesticity of preparing a meal while Matthew sat at her small kitchen table, cleaning his revolver and rifle, struck Hannah as both strange and oddly right. They talked easily as she cooked, exchanging stories about their childhood's Matthews on a small ranch in Colorado. Hannah's following her father from one frontier town to another as he served as marshal. "It must have been hard moving so often," Matthew observed as Hannah served a simple but hearty stew. "Sometimes," she admitted, joining him at the table, "but it taught me to adapt, and Father always made sure I had books no matter where we were." Said education was more important than fancy dresses or parties. "Smart man," Matthew commented, "though you'd look fine in fancy dresses too, I'd wager." Hannah felt a blush warming her cheeks at the unexpected compliment. "I wouldn't know, never had much occasion for them." "No suitors in Pine Creek?" Matthew asked, his tone casual though his eyes watched her carefully. Hannah focused on her stew, suddenly self-conscious. "A few expressed interest when we first arrived. Father scared most of them off." Matthew chuckled. "I can imagine. What about you?" Hannah asked, turning the conversation away from herself. No wife waiting somewhere. A shadow passed over Matthew's features. There was someone once. She didn't care for the uncertainties of a lawman's life. "I'm sorry," Hannah said softly. Matthew shrugged. "It was years ago." "Some people aren't meant for putting down roots." The comment stung more than it should have, reminding Hannah of her earlier thoughts about Matthew's eventual departure. "And you're one of them?" she asked, keeping her tone light. Matthew was quiet for a moment, his eyes meeting hers across the table. "I used to think so," he finally said. "Now I'm not so sure." The simple statement hung in the air between them, laden with possibilities neither was ready to acknowledge. Hannah broke the moment by rising to clear the dishes, her heart beating unexpectedly fast. "I should check the store before turning in," she said, needing some distance to collect her thoughts. "I'll come with you," Matthew offered, standing as well. They descended to the darkened store, lamp in hand, checking doors and windows one final time. In the storeroom, Matthew arranged his bedroll while Hannah ensured the newly boarded window was secure. "It should hold through the night," Matthew assured her. "I'm a light sleeper. If anyone tries to get in, I'll hear them." Hannah nodded, suddenly awkward now that the moment of parting for the night had arrived. "If you need anything—" "I'll be fine," Matthew said gently. "Get some rest, Hannah." "Good night then," she said, turning to go. "Hannah," Matthew called softly, stopping her at the door. When she looked back, his expression was serious in the lamplight. "Whatever happens with Blackwood, whatever we discover about your father, you're not alone in this. Remember that." The echo of his words from their first meeting at the cemetery wasn't lost on Hannah. "I'm beginning to believe that," she admitted quietly before heading upstairs, the weight of the day's events finally settling on her shoulders. In her room, Hannah changed into her nightgown and sat at the small vanity to brush out her hair. Through the floorboards, she could hear Matthew moving about below, the soft sound strangely reassuring. For the first time since her father's death, the house didn't feel empty. It was a dangerous comfort, she knew. Matthew Reed was here because of a promise to her father, not because of any particular attachment to her. When this business with Blackwood was finished, he would move on back to Wyoming Territory, or wherever his restless spirit called him next. And yet, as Hannah slipped beneath her quilt, she couldn't help remembering the way Matthew had looked at her across the dinner table, or the gentleness in his voice when he'd told her she wasn't alone. Perhaps it was foolish to let herself feel anything for a drifter, but Hannah was beginning to suspect her heart might not give her much choice in the matter. Morning arrived with pale sunlight filtering through Hannah's curtains. For a moment, she lay still, listening to the familiar creaks of the building and the unfamiliar sounds of movement in the store below. Matthew was already awake and moving about, she realized. Dressing quickly in a practical brown skirt and cream-colored blouse, Hannah pinned her hair in its usual style and made her way downstairs. She found Matthew in the main room of the store, a pot of coffee already brewing on the small stove. "You're up early," she observed, noting that he'd already folded his bedroll and tidied the storeroom. Matthew looked up from the newspaper he'd been reading, his smile making her heart beat a little faster. "Old habits, never could sleep past dawn, even when I had the chance." "Is that today's paper?" Hannah asked, pouring herself a cup of the strong coffee. Matthew nodded, his expression turning serious. "There's something you should see." He turned the paper toward her, pointing to a small announcement near the back pages. Hannah read it quickly, her coffee forgotten. "The territorial governor is coming to Pine Creek next week. We never get such high-profile visitors." "Read on," Matthew urged. "Governor Williams will be meeting with town officials and business leaders to discuss regional development, including potential railroad expansions." "Railroad expansions," Hannah repeated, looking up at Matthew. "This has to be connected to Blackwood's land purchases." "And your father's suspicions," Matthew agreed. "The timing is too perfect to be coincidence." Hannah set down the paper, her mind racing. "If the governor is announcing a railroad coming through Pine Creek, property values will skyrocket overnight. And Blackwood wants to own as much of the route as possible before that happens," Matthew finished, "including your store, which sits at what would become the center of town if the railroad comes through," Hannah realized. "No wonder he's been so persistent." Matthew's expression darkened. "Persistent enough to remove obstacles permanently." Hannah paced the length of the counter, thinking aloud. "But why kill my father? Why not just wait him out or increase the offer until he accepted?" "Because your father discovered something more," Matthew suggested. "Something beyond just the railroad plans. He wrote about confronting Blackwood, about everyone in Pine Creek being in danger of losing everything. What could be worse than Blackwood buying up property before a railroad announcement?" Hannah wondered. Matthew was silent for a moment, his brow furrowed in thought. "What if the railroad isn't coming through Pine Creek at all?" Hannah stopped pacing. "What do you mean? What if Blackwood knows the railroad is actually planning a different route, one that bypasses Pine Creek entirely?" Matthew's eyes met hers, serious and intent. "He could be buying property cheap, planning to sell it to desperate people fleeing dying towns once the actual route is announced. That's..." Hannah struggled to find words. "That would destroy Pine Creek. Without the railroad connection, businesses would fail, people would leave. And Blackwood would make a fortune buying low here and selling high wherever the railroad actually goes," Matthew concluded grimly. Hannah sank onto a stool, the implications settling over her. "If that's what my father discovered, it explains everything. Blackwood couldn't risk him warning the town. The governor's visit might be our only chance to find out the truth," Matthew said. "We need to see those railroad plans." "How?" "They'll be heavily guarded, especially if Blackwood has something to hide." Matthew's expression turned resolute. "I have some experience with obtaining information that people don't want to share." "You mean breaking into Blackwood's office?" Hannah clarified, torn between shock and grudging approval. "I mean finding evidence of what happened to your father," Matthew corrected. "And potentially saving an entire town from ruin." Hannah studied him for a long moment, seeing the determination in his eyes. This was the lawman her father had trusted, a man willing to bend rules when justice demanded it. "When?" she asked simply. "Tonight," Matthew decided. "Blackwood will be busy with preparations for the governor's visit. The silver dollar will be full, making it easier to move unnoticed." "I'm coming with you," Hannah stated, her tone brooking no argument. Matthew shook his head immediately. "Too dangerous." "It's my father we're seeking justice for," Hannah countered. My store and home at risk, my town in danger. I'm coming, Matthew. They locked eyes in a silent battle of wills. Finally, Matthew sighed. You'll stay outside as lookout. At the first sign of trouble, you run. No heroics. Agreed. Agreed, Hannah conceded, knowing it was the best compromise she would get. The bell above the door signaled the arrival of their first customer, ending the discussion. As the day progressed, Hannah found it difficult to concentrate on business, her mind constantly returning to their planned evening excursion. What they were considering was illegal breaking and entering, at minimum. If caught, they could face jail time, or worse if Blackwood's men decided to take matters into their own hands. Yet the alternative, allowing Blackwood to profit from her father's death and the potential destruction of Pine Creek, was unthinkable. By the time she closed the store that evening, Hannah's determination had only grown stronger. "Are you sure about this?" Matthew asked as they ate a quick dinner upstairs. "Once we start, there's no turning back." Hannah met his gaze steadily. "I've never been more sure of anything. My father gave his life trying to protect this town. I won't let that be in vain." Matthew nodded, a new respect in his eyes. "We'll wait until after midnight. The saloon crowd will be thinning by then, but there should still be enough activity to cover our movements." As they prepared for the night ahead, Hannah changed into her darkest, clothing a navy skirt and black shirtwaist that would blend into the shadows. She pinned her hair tightly to her head, then wrapped a dark shawl around her shoulders. Matthew had changed as well, wearing all black with his gun belt strapped securely to his hip. He'd applied a smudge of dirt to his face to dull the reflection of his skin in moonlight, a trick, he explained, that he'd learned tracking outlaws at night. "Ready?" he asked as the clock struck midnight. Hannah nodded, trying to project more confidence than she felt. "Ready." They slipped out through the back door, locking it carefully behind them. The night was clear and cool, stars glittering overhead as they made their way through back alleys toward the Silver Dollar Saloon. Music and raucous laughter spilled from the establishment, growing louder as they approached. Matthew led Hannah to a shadowed alcove behind the building, where they could observe the comings and goings through the saloon's back entrance. Several men stumbled out during their watch, too drunk to notice the pair hidden in darkness. "Blackwood's office is on the second floor," Matthew whispered, pointing to a window where lamplight still burned. "He keeps late hours." "How will we get in?" Hannah asked, eyeing the distance to the nearest window. "There's a back staircase for deliveries," Matthew explained. "I watched the place yesterday while you were serving customers. Staff uses it to bring up supplies without disturbing the main floor." Hannah raised an eyebrow. "You've been planning this longer than you let on." Matthew's teeth flashed white in the darkness. "Always have a plan before you need one. Another lesson from your father." They watched for another 20 minutes until the light in Blackwood's office finally extinguished. A few minutes later, a well-dressed figure emerged from the back door, Blackwood himself, accompanied by Silas. The two men conversed briefly before Blackwood departed in the direction of his home, a large house at the north end of town. Silas remained, lighting a cigar and taking up position near the door. "Complication," Matthew murmured. "Silas doesn't look like he's leaving anytime soon." Hannah studied the scene, an idea forming. "I can draw him away." Matthew turned to her sharply. "Absolutely not. I won't put myself in danger," Hannah assured him. "Just create a distraction at the front of the saloon. When he investigates, you slip in the back. And if he recognizes you, or decides to escort you home, then I'll scream bloody murder and bring the sheriff running," Hannah replied practically. "I'm not helpless, Matthew." After a moment's consideration, Matthew nodded reluctantly. "Create your distraction, then get immediately back to the store. Don't wait for me." "Be careful," Hannah said, impulsively squeezing his hand before slipping away toward the front of the saloon. Her heart pounded as she circled the building, staying in shadows until she reached the main street. Taking a deep breath, Hannah stepped into the pool of light near the saloon's front entrance. Several cowboys lounging on the porch eyed her with interest. A respectable woman out alone at this hour was an unusual sight. Hannah ignored them, moving instead to where several horses were hitched. With a silent apology to the animals' owners, she quickly untied 3 of them, then slapped the nearest horse's flank sharply. The startled animal reared and bolted, causing the others to follow suit. "Hey, my horse!" a drunken cowboy shouted, stumbling down the steps as the animals galloped away. The commotion drew several more men from inside, including, as Hannah had hoped, Silas, who emerged from around the building to investigate the disturbance. Keeping her face turned away, Hannah slipped into the crowd of onlookers that had formed, then gradually edged away from the scene. Once clear, she hurried back toward the store, hoping she'd created enough of a diversion for Matthew to gain entry unnoticed. The plan had worked better than expected, with horses to chase and drunken cowboys arguing over whose fault it was. Silas would be occupied for several minutes at least. Hannah let herself back into the store, her hands trembling slightly from the rush of adrenaline. Now all she could do was wait and worry about Matthew, alone in the lion's den. Matthew wasted no time once Silas departed to investigate the commotion at the front of the saloon. Moving swiftly, he climbed the back stairs, testing each step to avoid creaks that might alert the few remaining patrons below. At the top landing, he paused, listening carefully before proceeding down a narrow hallway toward Blackwood's office. The door was locked, as expected, but yielded quickly to the slim metal tools. Matthew extracted from his pocket another skill from his days tracking outlaws. Inside, the office was dark except for moonlight filtering through the windows. Matthew closed the door silently behind him, then struck a match to light the small lantern he'd brought. Blackwood's office spoke of a man who valued appearances, expensive furniture, imported rugs, and a large desk that dominated the room. Matthew moved methodically, searching drawers and cabinets for anything related to railroad plans or land purchases. In the bottom drawer of the desk, locked but easily opened with his tools, Matthew found what they were seeking: a leather portfolio containing maps, contracts, and correspondence. He spread the documents across the desk, quickly scanning their contents. The maps confirmed their suspicions: detailed plans showing a railroad route that bypassed Pine Creek entirely, instead cutting through a valley 10 miles east. Property markers indicated land already purchased by B Investments, Blackwood's company, Matthew presumed. More damning were the letters from the railroad company, clearly stating the planned route and offering partnerships to those with advance knowledge. Blackwood had indeed been positioning himself to profit from Pine Creek's eventual decline, but it was a small leather notebook tucked among the papers that caught Matthew's attention most. Opening it, he recognized the handwriting immediately: Thomas Morrison's distinctive script. The journal was similar to the one Hannah had, but smaller, clearly meant to be carried in a pocket. Matthew's blood ran cold as he read the final entries, describing Thomas's discovery of Blackwood's scheme and his confrontation with the man. The last entry, dated the day of Thomas's death, was brief but chilling. Blackwood threatened Hannah: "If I go public, said accidents happen to stubborn women too. Meeting him tonight to negotiate. Don't trust him, but must protect Hannah. If anything happens to me, evidence is hidden in the store's foundation stone, north corner." Matthew carefully gathered the documents, including Thomas's journal, and slipped them into his shirt. He was replacing the portfolio in the drawer when a floorboard creaked in the hallway outside. Instantly, he extinguished the lantern and moved to the side of the door, gun drawn. The door handle turned slowly, then the door swung open. A figure entered, not Blackwood or Silas, but one of the saloon workers, coming to clean the office. Matthew remained perfectly still in the shadows as the young man lit a lamp and began dusting the furniture. For several tense minutes, Matthew waited, knowing his chances of slipping out unnoticed were dwindling. When the worker finally moved to the far side of the room, Matthew seized his opportunity, sliding silently through the door and down the hallway. He had nearly reached the back stairs when a voice called out behind him. "Hey, who's there?" Matthew didn't look back, taking the stairs two at a time and bursting out into the alley. He heard shouts above him, then the sound of pursuit. Keeping to the shadows, he wove through back streets and alleys, eventually doubling back toward Morrison's general store. Hannah was waiting anxiously when Matthew slipped through the back door, locking it securely behind him. Her relief at seeing him unharmed quickly turned to concern when she noticed his labored breathing. "What happened?" she asked, helping him remove his coat. "Almost got caught," Matthew explained between breaths, "but I got what we needed." He withdrew the documents from inside his shirt, spreading them on the counter. "You were right, Hannah. Blackwood knows the railroad is bypassing Pine Creek. He's been buying property cheap here while secretly purchasing land along the actual route." Hannah examined the maps, her expression hardening. "The snake. He's been lying to everyone, driving up anticipation about the railroad coming here while knowing it never will." "That's not all," Matthew said quietly, handing her the small journal. "This was among his papers. It belonged to your father." Hannah's hands trembled as she took the journal, recognizing her father's handwriting immediately. She read the final entry, tears filling her eyes. "He was protecting me," she whispered. "He went to meet Blackwood the night he died." "And never came home," Matthew finished gently. "Hannah, this is proof. Your father wasn't just suspicious, he knew what Blackwood was doing and confronted him." Hannah closed the journal, wiping away tears with a determined gesture. "And Blackwood killed him for it, or had him killed." "There's more," Matthew said. "Your father hid evidence somewhere in the store in the foundation stone, north corner." Hannah's eyes widened. "The loose stone in the cellar. Father was always so careful about it, saying it was structural and shouldn't be disturbed. I never thought." Without waiting for Matthew to respond, Hannah grabbed a lamp and headed for the cellar door. Matthew followed close behind as she descended the narrow stairs into the cool, earthen-floored cellar where the store kept preserves, potatoes, and other goods that benefited from the consistent temperature. In the northeast corner, Hannah knelt beside a section of foundation wall, running her fingers along the stones until she found one that moved slightly under pressure. "Here," she said, setting the lamp down. "Help me pull it out." Together, they worked the stone free, revealing a small cavity behind it. Inside was an oilskin packet, carefully wrapped and tied. Hannah withdrew it with reverent hands, untying the cords that bound it. The packet contained several documents, deeds to properties Blackwood had purchased under various names, correspondence with railroad officials that had clearly been obtained surreptitiously. And most damning of all, a letter in Blackwood's own hand to Silas, dated the day before Thomas Morrison's death. Morrison knows too much. "Make it look like an accident, no witnesses." Hannah stared at the letter, emotions warring across her face, grief, rage, vindication. "We have him," she said finally, her voice steady despite the tears that threatened. "We have proof of what he did to Father." Matthew nodded grimly. "Enough to take to Sheriff Walton and the territorial authorities." "Not just them," Hannah said, a new determination in her voice. "The governor is coming in 3 days. He should know what kind of man Blackwood really is and what he's been planning for Pine Creek." "That's risky," Matthew cautioned. "Blackwood will know someone broke into his office soon if he doesn't already. He'll be on high alert, especially with the governor's visit approaching." "All the more reason to move quickly," Hannah insisted. "We should see Sheriff Walton first thing in the morning." Matthew agreed, helping Hannah replace the stone before they returned upstairs. The night was well advanced, the tension of their discoveries leaving them both drained yet too alert for sleep. "Try to rest," Matthew advised as Hannah gathered the documents into a secure bundle. "Tomorrow will be challenging." Hannah nodded, suddenly aware of how close they were standing, of the intimacy created by shared danger and purpose. "Matthew," she said softly, "thank you. For believing me about Father, for helping me find the truth." Matthew's expression softened, his eyes warm in the lamplight. Your father knew you'd never stop searching for answers. It's one of the things he loved most about you, your determination. One of the things he wrote to you about, you mean, Hannah said, a hint of a smile touching her lips despite the emotional weight of the evening. Among other qualities, Matthew admitted, his gaze holding hers a moment longer than necessary. Hannah felt her heart quicken, aware of a shift between them, a possibility opening like a flower turning toward sunlight. But now wasn't the time, not with Blackwood's threat still looming and her father's death still unavenged. "Good night, Matthew," she said, reluctantly stepping away. "I'll see you in the morning." As she climbed the stairs to her room, Hannah felt both heavier with the confirmation of her worst fears about her father's death, and lighter with the knowledge that justice might finally be possible. And beneath both feelings was something new and fragile, an awareness of Matthew Reed not just as her protector or her father's friend, but as a man who saw her strength and valued it. For the first time since kneeling at her father's grave, Hannah allowed herself to imagine a future beyond grief and obligation, a future that might include the quiet, steady presence of the man who had come into her life bearing wildflowers and an outstretched hand. Sheriff Walton's face grew increasingly grim as he examined the documents Hannah and Matthew had presented. They had arrived at his office at first light, before most of the town was stirring, bringing with them both the evidence from Blackwood's office and Thomas Morrison's hidden cache. "This is serious business," Walton said finally, setting down Blackwood's incriminating letter. "Murder, fraud, conspiracy, enough to hang a man." "Then you believe us?" Hannah asked, tense in her chair across from the sheriff's desk. Walton nodded slowly. "Your father came to me with suspicions about Blackwood's land deals, but he didn't have proof. I advised caution." Regret clouded his features. "Perhaps if I'd taken his concerns more seriously." "You couldn't have known," Matthew said, his steady presence beside Hannah a comfort. "Blackwood was careful, not careful enough," Walton observed, tapping the documents. "The question now is how to proceed. Blackwood has friends in the territorial government, judges who owe him favors." "The governor," Hannah suggested. "He'll be here in 3 days." Surely he would want to know about corruption involving railroad development. Sheriff Walton considered this. "Governor Williams is a straight shooter, from what I've heard, but approaching him will be difficult with Blackwood watching his every move." "We have 3 days to figure it out," Matthew pointed out. "In the meantime, what about Blackwood? He'll know someone broke into his office by now." Walton stroked his mustache thoughtfully. "I can't arrest him without revealing what we know and how we got it. Breaking and entering isn't exactly legal, even for a good cause." "So we wait?" Hannah asked, frustration evident in her voice. "We prepare," Walton corrected. "I'll deputize Reed here, give him some official standing, and I'll keep a close eye on Blackwood and Sela's without tipping our hand." He looked at Hannah seriously. "You should stay with friends outside of town until this is resolved. Blackwood might suspect your involvement." Hannah straightened in her chair. "I'm not leaving my store or my home. If I disappear, he'll know something's wrong." "She's right," Matthew agreed, though concern showed in his eyes. "Hannah should maintain her normal routine. I'll stay close." Walton sighed, recognizing the determination in both their faces. "Very well, but no unnecessary risks. Keep these documents secure. They are our only leverage." As they left the sheriff's office, the town was coming to life around them, shopkeepers opening their doors, wagons delivering goods, children running toward the schoolhouse. Pine Creek looked peaceful in the morning light, its citizens unaware of the corruption threatening their future or the justice about to unfold. "What now?" Hannah asked as they walked back toward the store. "We open for business," Matthew said simply. "Act normal, watch for Blackwood's reaction. He'll make a move once he realizes his office was searched." "And when he does," Hannah pressed. Matthew's hand brushed against hers, a brief touch of reassurance. "Then we'll be ready." The day passed with excruciating slowness, each customer entering the store causing Hannah to tense until she confirmed it wasn't Blackwood or one of his men. Matthew remained nearby, helping with store tasks while keeping a watchful eye on the street outside. By mid-afternoon, word had spread through town about a break-in at the Silver Dollar the previous night. Mrs. Williams from the boarding house shared the gossip as Hannah measured fabric for her. They say nothing was stolen, but Mr. Blackwood is in quite a state, the older woman confided. Has men searching the town for someone he claims stole private business documents. Hannah maintained a carefully neutral expression. How dreadful, I hope they find the culprit. Sheriff's involved too, Mrs. Williams continued, unaware of Hannah's internal tension. Though between us, he doesn't seem in any hurry to solve the case. Never did care much for Blackwood, our sheriff. After Mrs. Williams departed, Hannah joined Matthew near the window where he'd been monitoring the street. They're searching the town, she said quietly. It's only a matter of time before they come here. Let them come, Matthew replied, his hand resting casually near his holster. We have the sheriff on our side now. As if summoned by their conversation, the door opened to admit Victor Blackwood himself, accompanied by Silas. Blackwood was immaculately dressed as always, but his eyes held a coldness that sent a chill down Hannah's spine. Miss Morrison, he greeted with false warmth, and Mr. Reed, still helping around the store, I see. Mr. Blackwood, Hannah acknowledged, moving behind the counter where she felt more secure. What can I do for you today? Blackwood's smile didn't reach his eyes. I find myself in need of assistance. Some important papers have gone missing from my office. I thought perhaps you might have heard something given your central location in town. I'm afraid not, Hannah replied evenly. Though I did hear about the break-in, how unfortunate. Blackwood's gaze shifted between Hannah and Matthew, assessing, indeed, most unfortunate. Especially for whoever took documents that weren't theirs to take. Matthew stepped forward slightly, positioning himself between Hannah and the two men. Sounds like a matter for the sheriff, not a general store proprietor. Oh, the sheriff is involved, Blackwood assured them, his tone hardening. But I find private solutions are often more efficient than legal ones. The threat hung in the air, unmistakable. Hannah felt her heart racing but kept her expression neutral. If there's nothing you need to purchase, Mr. Blackwood, I have customers to attend to. Blackwood's eyes narrowed fractionally before his smooth facade returned. Of course, my apologies for taking your time. He turned to leave, then paused. One last thing, Miss Morrison. My offer for the store expires tomorrow. After that, well. He glanced around the well-stocked shelves. Properties can lose value so quickly when misfortune strikes. With that parting threat, he departed, Silas following after casting a menacing glare at Matthew. Once they were gone, Hannah released a shaky breath. He knows. He suspects, Matthew corrected, but he can't be certain, or he'd have made a more direct move. Hannah moved to the window, watching Blackwood and Silas cross the street toward the saloon. We need to get those documents somewhere safer than the store, if they search here. Already taken care of, Matthew assured her. Sheriff Walton has the originals locked in his safe. What we have are copies. Hannah turned to him in surprise. When did you arrange that? This morning, when you were helping that rancher with his bulk order, Matthew explained. I slipped out the back to meet Walton. Relief washed over Hannah, followed by a rush of gratitude. You think of everything. Not everything, Matthew admitted, his expression turning serious. Blackwood's dangerous, Hannah. That wasn't just a business threat he made, he's planning something. The governor arrives tomorrow, Hannah reminded him. If we can just hold out until then. We will, Matthew promised, though concern lingered in his eyes. But I don't think we should separate tonight, not even with me in the storeroom and you upstairs. Hannah understood his meaning immediately, heat rising to her cheeks despite the gravity of their situation. That wouldn't be proper. A hint of a smile touched Matthew's lips. I think we're well past worrying about propriety, Hannah. I can sleep in your father's room, door closed, of course. The suggestion made practical sense, yet Hannah couldn't help the flutter of awareness that accompanied the thought of Matthew sleeping just across the hall from her. Very well, she agreed, turning back to her work to hide her conflicted emotions. but only until this business with Blackwood is resolved. As evening approached, Hannah found herself increasingly on edge, jumping at every sound from the street. Matthew convinced her to close the store early, securing doors and windows with extra care before they retreated upstairs. Hannah prepared a simple dinner, though neither had much appetite. They ate in tense silence, listening for any unusual sounds from below. When they finished, Matthew insisted on checking the store once more before they retired. "All quiet," he reported upon returning. "I've set some simple alarms tin cans near the doors that will rattle if anyone tries to enter." Hannah nodded, too tense for conversation. She moved about the kitchen, washing dishes and putting things away, hyper-aware of Matthew's presence as he checked the locks on the apartment windows. "You should try to sleep," he suggested gently, noting her exhaustion. "I'll keep watch for a while." "I'm not sure I can sleep," Hannah admitted, "not with everything." She gestured vaguely, encompassing their situation, the danger, the proximity of justice for her father. Matthew approached slowly, stopping an arm's length away. "Hannah," he said softly, "we're going to get through this. Blackwood will face justice for what he did to your father and what he planned for this town. And then what?" The question escaped before Hannah could stop it, revealing more of her heart than she'd intended. Matthew's expression softened, understanding in his eyes. "And then, whatever you want to happen next." The simple statement hung between them, laden with possibilities neither had dared speak aloud. Hannah took a step forward, closing the distance between them slightly. "What if what I want is for you to stay?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not just because of Blackwood or my father, but because..." A tremendous crash from below interrupted her words, followed by the sound of splintering wood and their improvised alarms clattering wildly. Matthew's hand went immediately to his gun. "Stay here," he ordered, moving quickly toward the stairs. "No," Hannah countered, grabbing her father's shotgun from where it leaned against the wall. "Together." There was no time to argue. They descended the stairs cautiously, Matthew in the lead. The store below was dark except for moonlight streaming through the shattered front window. Glass littered the floor, and smoke filled the air, not from gunfire, Hannah realized with horror, but from flames already licking at the displays nearest the window. "Fire." She gasped, moving instinctively toward the blaze. Matthew caught her arm. "Wait, it could be a trap." No sooner had he spoken than a shot rang out, the bullet splintering the door frame beside them. Matthew pushed Hannah down behind a counter, returning fire toward the window where the shot had originated. "Back door," he directed, keeping his body between Hannah and the potential shooter. "We can't fight both the fire and whoever's out there." Hannah nodded, crawling toward the rear of the store as smoke thickened around them. They had nearly reached the storeroom when a figure loomed in the back doorway. Silas, revolver raised. "Going somewhere," he sneered, his gun trained on Hannah. Matthew fired without hesitation, the shot catching Silas in the shoulder and spinning him backward. He didn't wait to see if the man would recover, grabbing Hannah's hand and pulling her toward the now unguarded door. They burst into the alley behind the store, the cool night air a momentary relief from the smoke. Shouts came from the street in front, townsfolk noticing the fire, calling for the volunteer fire brigade. But mixed with those cries were other voices, closer and more threatening. "This way," Matthew urged, leading Hannah toward the shadows at the end of the alley. They had only gone a few steps when another figure stepped into their path, Blackwood himself, a rifle in his hands. "I warned you what happens to those who cross me," he said coldly, raising the weapon. "Your father didn't listen either, Miss Morrison." Matthew pushed Hannah aside as Blackwood fired, the bullet grazing Matthew's arm instead of finding its intended target. Despite the injury, Matthew returned fire, forcing Blackwood to duck behind a rain barrel. "Run." Matthew shouted to Hannah, providing covering fire as they darted down a side passage between buildings. Behind them, the general store's roof had caught fire, flames illuminating the night sky with an eerie orange glow. Townspeople were gathering, forming a bucket brigade from the nearest well. Sheriff Walton's voice could be heard directing the effort, unaware of the deadly pursuit happening in the shadows behind the buildings. Hannah and Matthew raced through back alleys, the sound of pursuit never far behind. Matthew's wounded arm was bleeding steadily, his face pale in the moonlight, but he pressed on, determined to get Hannah to safety. The church, Hannah gasped as they paused for breath in the shadow of the livery stable. Father Michaels will help us. Matthew nodded grimly, checking the ammunition in his revolver. Only 2 shots remained. They moved carefully toward the white clapboard church at the edge of town, staying in shadows whenever possible. The building was dark, the minister likely already responding to the fire alarm, but the door was unlocked, as always a sanctuary in more ways than one. Once inside, Hannah barred the door behind them, then turned to examine Matthew's wound in the dim light filtering through the stained glass windows. "It's not deep," he assured her, though the blood-stained sleeve suggested otherwise. "We need to get word to Sheriff Walton about what's happening." "You need bandaging first," Hannah insisted, tearing a strip from her petticoat to bind the wound. As she worked, the reality of their situation settled over her, her store and home burning, Blackwood hunting them through the night, Matthew injured protecting her. "I'm sorry," she whispered, securing the makeshift bandage. "My store, all your belongings." Matthew caught her hand, holding it against his chest where she could feel his heartbeat, strong and steady. "Buildings can be rebuilt, Hannah. What matters is that you're safe." Their eyes met in the dimness, unspoken feelings passing between them with an intensity that made Hannah's breath catch. Despite the danger, despite the loss of her home and livelihood, in that moment, Hannah felt a certainty she hadn't experienced since before her father's death, a sense that whatever happened next, she wouldn't face it alone. The moment was broken by the sound of footsteps on the church steps outside. Matthew moved Hannah behind him, raising his revolver toward the door. "Reed, Miss Morrison," Sheriff Walton's voice called. "Are you in there? It's safe to come out." Hannah and Matthew exchanged cautious glances. "Could be a trick," Matthew whispered. "Only one way to find out," Hannah replied, moving toward a side window that would give them a view of the entrance without exposing themselves. Peering out, she saw Sheriff Walton standing alone, badge gleaming in the moonlight. "It's him," she confirmed. "Alone." Matthew lowered his gun slightly, but remained wary as Hannah unbarred the door, opening it just enough to speak to the sheriff. "Are Blackwood and his men in custody?" she asked without preamble. Walton's expression was grim. "Silas is, with a bullet in his shoulder courtesy of Reed here, I'm guessing. Blackwood slipped away in the confusion, but I've got men searching. The whole town saw him start that fire. There's no hiding his true colors now." Relief washed over Hannah, though she knew the danger wasn't entirely past. "My store, the brigade saved most of it," Walton assured her. "The front's damaged and there's water and smoke everywhere, but the structure's sound. Your living quarters weren't touched." Hannah sagged against the doorframe, unexpected tears springing to her eyes. Matthew's hand found her shoulder, a steady support as emotion overwhelmed her. "The governor's train arrives tomorrow afternoon," Walton continued. "I've sent a rider to the next station with a message about what's happened here. He'll have a proper escort waiting when he arrives." "And Blackwood?" Matthew asked, his voice tight with pain from his wound. "Won't get far," Walton promised. "Every ranch hand and shopkeeper in Pine Creek is looking for him now. Nobody takes kindly to a man who'd burned down a lady's store and home." The community's support warmed Hannah despite the night's horrors. These people had been her father's friends and neighbors, and now they were rallying to her defense. "You both should come to my office," Walton suggested. "It's safer there until we find Blackwood." Hannah looked at Matthew, noting the pallor of his face and the blood seeping through her makeshift bandage. "Matthew needs a doctor first," she insisted. "Doc Miller's at my office already, tending to some minor injuries from the fire brigade," Walton informed them. "He can see to read there." With the sheriff escorting them, they made their way through town toward the jailhouse. The general store was still surrounded by townspeople with buckets, though the fire appeared to be extinguished. Hannah paused to look at the damage, the shattered window, the charred goods visible inside, the water running in streams from the doorway. "It could have been much worse," Matthew said softly beside her, understanding her distress. Hannah nodded, her gaze traveling to the sign above the door, Morrison and daughter, somehow untouched by the flames. "We'll rebuild," she decided, drawing strength from Matthew's presence beside her. At the sheriff's office, Doc Miller cleaned and properly bandaged Matthew's wound, declaring it painful but not serious. Silas glared at them from his cell, his own shoulder bandaged, his future likely to include a hangman's noose once his role in Thomas Morrison's death was confirmed. "You should both get some rest," Sheriff Walton advised when the doctor had finished. "You can use the cot in the back room, Miss Morrison. Reed can bunk out here where I can keep an eye on our prisoner." Hannah was reluctant to be separated from Matthew, but propriety demanded it, especially now that they were in public view. "Thank you, Sheriff," she said, squeezing Matthew's uninjured hand briefly before withdrawing to the offered room. Sleep came fitfully, her dreams filled with fire and pursuit, but whenever she woke, the sound of quiet conversation between Matthew and the sheriff in the outer office reassured her. By dawn, she felt steadier, ready to face whatever the day might bring. When she emerged from the back room, Matthew was already awake, looking better than she expected after the night's ordeal. He smiled when he saw her, a warm look that made her heart flutter despite their circumstances. "Any word on Blackwood?" she asked, accepting the cup of coffee Sheriff Walton offered. "Not yet," Walton admitted, "but every road's being watched. He won't get far, especially not with the governor's train coming today." The mention of the governor reminded Hannah of the evidence. They'd gathered proof not just of her father's murder, but of Blackwood's scheme to defraud the entire town. "The documents safe in my desk," Walton assured her, patting the drawer. "Governor Williams will see them as soon as he arrives." The morning passed slowly, Hannah alternating between worry over Blackwood's whereabouts and concern for Matthew, who insisted his wound was merely uncomfortable despite evidence that it pained him considerably. By noon, word came that the governor's train had departed the previous station and would arrive in Pine Creek by 3 o'clock. "I should check on the store," Hannah decided, needing to assess the damage in daylight, see what can be salvaged. "I'll come with you," Matthew said immediately, rising from his chair. Sheriff Walton nodded approval. "Take my deputy with you as well. Blackwood's still out there somewhere." The trio made their way to Morrison's general store, now a sorry sight with its shattered window boarded up and water damage visible even from outside. Inside, the smell of smoke lingered, but Hannah was heartened to see that much of the inventory had survived, protected by the quick response of the townspeople. "It's not as bad as I feared," she admitted, surveying the damage. "Most of this can be cleaned or replaced." Matthew moved to her side, his expression gentle. "Your father would be proud of how you've handled all this, Hannah." The simple words touched her deeply, bringing unexpected tears to her eyes. "I hope so," she whispered. They spent the next hour taking inventory of the damage, making lists of what needed to be replaced or repaired. The deputy remained vigilant, positioning himself near the door where he could watch the street. Several townspeople stopped by to offer help or condolences, their support a balm to Hannah's spirit. By mid-afternoon, a whistle in the distance announced the approach of the governor's train. Hannah and Matthew exchanged a significant look. The moment of truth was approaching. "We should join Sheriff Walton at the station," Matthew suggested, setting aside the broom he'd been using to sweep up broken glass. Hannah nodded, removing the apron she donned to protect her dress from the soot and water damage. "I want to be there when the governor learns what Blackwood has done." The deputy escorted them to the station, where a crowd had already gathered to welcome the territorial governor. Sheriff Walton stood on the platform, the documents detailing Blackwood's crimes secured in a leather portfolio under his arm. As the train pulled into the station with a hiss of steam and screech of brakes, an unexpected commotion erupted at the edge of the crowd. Hannah turned to see several men struggling with someone, and then Blackwood broke free, a gun in his hand, desperation in his eyes. "Raid," he shouted, raising the weapon. "This is your doing." Matthew pushed Hannah behind him as Blackwood fired, the bullet whizzing past them to embed itself in the station wall. Before Blackwood could fire again, Sheriff Walton and 2 deputies converged on him, wrestling him to the ground and disarming him. The crowd erupted in shouts and movement, people scrambling for safety even as the governor's party emerged from the train, confused by the chaos greeting them. Through it all, Hannah clung to Matthew, her heart pounding with the realization of how close they had come to tragedy. "Are you all right?" Matthew asked urgently, his hands on her shoulders as he searched her face for signs of shock or injury. Hannah nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. The events of the past days, her father's murder, the fire, the shootout, and now this final confrontation crashed over her in a wave that left her trembling. Without hesitation, Matthew drew her into his arms, holding her securely against his chest. Hannah went willingly, finding comfort in his strength and the steady beat of his heart beneath her cheek. "It's over," he murmured against her hair. "He can't hurt you anymore." Hannah wasn't sure how long they stood like that, oblivious to the stares of townspeople and the governor's party alike. When she finally drew back, composed once more, she found Sheriff Walton approaching with a distinguished-looking man she presumed to be Governor Williams. "Miss Morrison, Mr. Reed," Walton said formally, "may I present Governor James Williams?" "Governor, these are the citizens I mentioned in my message, the ones who uncovered Victor Blackwood's scheme." The governor extended his hand first to Hannah, then to Matthew. "Sheriff Walton has briefed me on the situation," he said gravely. "I understand you've both shown remarkable courage in exposing this corruption." "It was my father who discovered the truth first," Hannah said, finding her voice. "He paid for it with his life." Governor Williams nodded solemnly. "A sacrifice that won't be forgotten, Miss Morrison. I assure you Blackwood will face the full consequence of his actions." "And the railroad?" Matthew asked, the question that had started everything. "The people of Pine Creek deserve to know the truth." The governor sighed, glancing around at the townsfolk who had gathered closer, eager to hear his response. "The original plans did bypass Pine Creek," he admitted. "But in light of recent events and the evidence you've uncovered about Blackwood's manipulation, I believe a review of the route is warranted." A murmur of hope ran through the crowd. Governor Williams raised his hand for silence. "I make no promises," he cautioned. "But I will personally ensure that the Railroad Commission considers all factors, including the character and resilience of the communities along the proposed routes, before making their final decision." It wasn't a guarantee, but it was more than Pine Creek had before a fair chance, an honest assessment, the opportunity to fight for their future on level ground. Hannah felt a weight lift from her shoulders, not just from the governor's words, but from the knowledge that her father's death had not been in vain. As the governor moved on to address the larger crowd, Hannah turned to Matthew, finding him watching her with an expression that made her breath catch. "What happens now?" she asked softly, echoing her question from the night before the one interrupted by Blackwood's attack. Matthew took her hand, his touch gentle but sure. "Now," he said, "if you're willing, I'd like to help you rebuild your store and perhaps build something more together." Hannah's heart swelled with an emotion too big for words. Instead of speaking, she reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the strong line of his jaw. "I'd like that," she whispered, a future opening before her like a road stretching toward the horizon, unknown but full of promise. 3 months later, Hannah stood at her father's grave, arranging fresh wildflowers against the headstone, now softened by winter's first snow. The cemetery was peaceful in the late afternoon light, the town of Pine Creek visible in the distance, chimney smoke rising straight into the clear blue sky. So much had changed since that autumn day when she'd knelt here alone, grieving a loss that seemed unbearable. The general store had been repaired and reopened, busier than ever with the news that the Railroad Commission had indeed revised their plans. Pine Creek would get its station after all, though construction wouldn't begin until spring. Victor Blackwood and Silas had been tried and convicted, their sentencing providing a measure of justice for Thomas Morrison and closure for Hannah. The properties Blackwood had accumulated under false pretenses had been returned to their original owners or sold at fair prices, his scheme dismantled as thoroughly as his reputation. And Matthew had stayed just as he'd promised. He'd helped rebuild the store, working alongside the townspeople who had come to respect him as much as they had Thomas Morrison. He'd officially hung up his drifter's hat, accepting Sheriff Walton's offer to become a permanent deputy, a position that suited his skills and allowed him to remain in Pine Creek and in Hannah's life. "I thought I might find you here," a familiar voice said from behind her. Hannah turned to see Matthew dismounting from his horse, another bouquet of wildflowers in his hand. He joined her at the grave, placing his offering beside hers. "I wanted to tell him our news," Hannah explained, slipping her hand into Matthew's. The gold band on her finger caught the sunlight new enough that she still found herself admiring it throughout the day. Matthew's arm went around her waist, drawing her close against the winter chill. "I think he knows," he said softly. "I like to believe he's been watching over us all along." Hannah rested her head against his shoulder, remembering her father's words in that final letter to Matthew. "There's no one I'd trust more than you." How right he had been. "Ready to head back?" Matthew asked after a few minutes of peaceful silence. "Mrs. Williams is expecting us for dinner to celebrate our engagement." Hannah nodded, casting one last look at the grave. "Yes, I'm ready." As they walked arm in arm toward their waiting horses, Hannah reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment, from grief to danger to love, from solitary mourning to a future shared. The path hadn't been easy, but standing beside Matthew now, she wouldn't change a step of it. At the cemetery gate, Matthew paused, turning to face her with an expression so tender it made her heart ache with happiness. "You know," he said, brushing a snowflake from her cheek, "when I found you kneeling here that day, I never imagined where it would lead." Hannah smiled, remembering his words that had changed everything. "You don't have to be alone. I'm glad you stopped," she said simply, rising on tiptoes to kiss him. As they rode back toward Pine Creek, the town spread before them like a promise. Hannah knew with absolute certainty that she would never truly be alone again, and neither would Matthew. Together, they had found not just justice or purpose, but a love as vast and enduring as the western sky above them. In the wild territory where life was often harsh and uncertain, they had discovered the greatest frontier of all, a shared future, built on courage, trust, and the kind of love that turns strangers into family. And in that discovery, both Hannah and Matthew had found their true home at last.